Yes. So yes, we are all welcome back to this surgeries. On behalf of Time to Heal, I want to welcome everyone who has joined us so far in these legal surgeries. This surgeries is brought to us by Time to Heal, supported by the legal support team graciously. And the aim is to discuss topical issues that affect victims and survivors of domestic abuse. So far, this is the fourth week. We've had quite interesting topics. Thank you so much to all our presenters who have done so well. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Karuna, and thank you. I've forgotten one more presenter. I'm so sorry. Holly did the first one. Karuna did, and then I think the last one, second to the last one, was done by just pardon. By Zoe. Zoe also helped present. Actually, last week, Zoe did a presentation on the role of the Citizen Advice Bureau in supporting victims and survivors of domestic abuse. Today, graciously, we have Zhaira. Zhaira is going to be in a lot of discussions today. Thank you so much, Zhaira, for offering to help today. We are so grateful. Zhaira will be discussing a very important topic. It's titled Trauma-Informed Practice, specifically managing the impact of domestic abuse, trauma on victims and survivors in the justice system. So thank you so much. Please, whilst the discussion is going on, I will implore us to mute our microphones. If you've got questions at the end of the discussion, we will entertain questions. You can also drop a question on the chat, and then we make sure we read them. But apart from that, I think it's really a great pleasure to welcome us back to these legal surgeries. And to everyone who will be watching subsequently, please feel free to get in touch with us. And then the legal support team is there to answer as much question as they can within their expertise. So without taking much of our time, I want us to dive right in. So we'll be going straight to the discussion for today. And then I would like to invite Zhaira, who is our guest presenter today, to discuss the topic as given. Zhaira, over to you.
That's great, thanks, Kausar. Are you able to share the slides with everybody?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll just get started. As Lawson had said, I'm going to be speaking about trauma-informed practice and what that means for us as legal advisors. Trauma-informed practice is something that people that usually work in social work, social care, they're probably quite well attuned to what this is, but it's something that we're kind of trying to put more into the legal profession to get a better understanding of how it works and how it affects victims and witnesses when they're going to court. So I'll just pop on to the next slide. And I'll just go through what trauma is. I don't want to go through this in any great depth because, like say, Holly and Karuna have been through domestic abuse and what it really covers. So when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about stressful or life-threatening events or accidents which may be experienced as shock by an individual. So that can include things like domestic abuse, sexual assault, but it can even include things like surviving a natural disaster or the death of a loved one. So it can be quite personal to the person. So generally, trauma tends to be events that have happened that are beyond a person's control, and they can happen to anyone. It can be the case that what affects one person and can be seen to be traumatic to one isn't to another. So it very much is how we as people deal with things and the support we've had to kind of deal with it. And just looking at how trauma can affect people. So generally the event tends to be something that overwhelms an individual emotionally, mentally and physically. So sometimes trauma can make people feel quite helpless. They might exhibit fear or demonstrate physical stress symptoms as a response to the trauma they've experienced. A lot of the time as the trauma is not something that will go away overnight. It's something that they'll have to work through, and can result in people seeing how they see themselves in the world, as well as them not being able to reach their full potential. So it can have a real impact on various aspects of their life. And just looking specifically at domestic abuse, we know that that's now been enshrined into the law, which Holly covered in the first week. So it's just looking at, just briefly, what domestic abuse is, and we know that now also involves the pattern of coercive and controlling behaviour, and that's also within the law as well. It can also be with domestic abuse, it's very much the case that these individuals are suffering at the hands of someone that they know to love and trust, and it can be difficult for them to leave that relationship. And we should be aware that often when we're advising people, they might still be in a situation that poses significant risk to their safety and their emotional well-being. And quite often, after even they've left a relationship, they might struggle to feel safe after the incidents have happened, and it can affect them going forward. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide and take a look at how trauma impacts the brain. So I'm not by any means science inclined, or so this is just going to be very simple. But I think it's important that we look at how trauma impacts the brain, and then how that can come across in victims and witnesses, particularly when we're in court. So just looking at the reptilian brain, this is the part of the brain that usually deals with our general bodily functions and our unconscious workings, such as breathing and heartbeat. And then you've got the neocortex, which is usually referred to as the human brain. So that controls our logic, our thinking, imagination, planning and control. So it's quite a conscious part of the brain that we're aware of, that we control, and tends to be a bit slower than other parts of the brain. And then the limbic system is the part that we're most concerned about when we're talking about trauma and the effects it has on people. So this is your instinctive part of your brain, which controls your emotions, your fears, pleasures and reactions to situations. And it's within the limbic system that we've got the amygdala, which is a part of the brain which senses danger and kind of alerts us to panic and sets off that fight, flight or freeze response that we have in our bodies. And what happens is, when we are subject to trauma or a situation which implements that sense of danger for us, this part of the brain, the amygdala, is activated. It will then pump adrenaline through the body, and it shuts off non-crucial functions that we don't need. That's a survival instinct that we've had for many years. So for example, the hippocampus, which we would usually use to store memories, when the amygdala is triggered and we're pumping this adrenaline through the body, that's one of the things that's shut down. So we're no longer able to store memories. And that's why sometimes people find it difficult to recall information or specific details about the trauma that's happened, because that part of the brain has stopped functioning, they're not forming the memories, and it makes it difficult for things to come back to them. So just moving on to how that impacts clients then going forward. As I say, I think it's important that we understand how that affects the client then going forward. So quite often when someone's experienced trauma, it will affect their ability to communicate and recall memories, and we've just seen there that's due to the parts of the brain that were working at the time are not working, and that's not something that they have control over. So quite often trauma will impact memories and how they're stored, processed and recalled. So when you're talking to clients, you might find that they struggle to recall specific dates or times of things that have happened. They might not be able to recall information all at the one time. Information might come back to them later on, or it might come back in jumbled up pieces, and that's a response to the trauma that they've experienced. So that's something that we should be aware of when we're speaking to clients, that they're not deliberately not recalling information, it's their brain, like they're struggling. That's a trauma response. It also can impact their ability to trust other people, and for them to go and seek support from people, even if it's people that are trying to help them. So legal advisors, counsellors, police officers, etc. Quite often, people that have experienced trauma and in domestic abuse situations, they'll have been in a relationship where they should have been able to feel safe, they should have been able to trust the individual and feel supported, and that's been taken away from them. So quite often they'll find it difficult to build relationships with other people, so they might withdraw from people or isolate themselves, and that's a protective mechanism that their brain is telling them to put in place because they're struggling with who is okay to trust, who's not okay to trust. They might also have difficulty controlling their emotions. So we might see that as someone having an aggressive outburst, or they might struggle to regulate the emotions that they're feeling. That's again another trauma response, because they've got an inability to process what's happened to them. They've not had the support mechanisms in place to help them work through what's happened. Quite often as well, clients might feel that they're powerless or they're trapped. Again, that's because the situations they've been through, it's trauma responses, and they can't see a way how to get out that situation. And then finally, trauma can also affect a person's confidence. Again, this comes back to their lack of control over the situation, there being little choice for them, and quite often they can feel disempowered, which then in turn affects their confidence. And we know that that can then impact other areas of their life and stop them reaching their full potential. So for example, somebody that's continually subject to sort of emotional abuse and being told that they're not good enough might start to feel like they're not worthy, and that can become a reality for them when it's experienced over a period of time. As well, a domestic abuse victim might also feel personally responsible for what's happened to them, that they've maybe made a person act in a way, and again, they might be reluctant to then engage in criminal proceedings because they feel for some reason that they're at fault, and that's just the way that their brains processed what's happened to them, and they've tried to create a story and try to rationalise what's happened. So all this kind of information about how trauma impacts individuals isn't anything new. It's all scientific information that's been around for a while, but in the legal profession, we're probably quite guilty of being very black and white, and we've studied the law, we know how to apply it, but we don't know the effects that sometimes crime has on people. So I'm just going to move on to now how this kind of information is starting to impact the legal system, and specifically going to court, and what kind of differences we're making now. So as I mentioned, we're starting to get a better understanding of how trauma can impact individuals, and specifically when they're going to court, how it affects their ability to recall information and give evidence. We know that people that have experienced trauma can struggle to put information together and in the right order, and that might come across in court as them not being credible or reliable. But what we need to remember is what adjustments we can make for victims to make it easier for them to give their evidence. So it might be putting up special measures like screens or having a supporter. We might allow for more breaks in the process, but we are looking at ways to make it a bit more accessible and efficient for victims and witnesses. We also know that the more a person's rights have been violated by another, the more psychological trauma they're likely to experience. So we're starting to again get a better understanding of that in the legal profession, and we know that we're starting to understand that sort of situations that are prolonged, have happened in a relationship, or are difficult to escape from, are most likely have the most psychological impact. So situations of domestic abuse, child abuse, human trafficking, there tends to be more of a traumatic impact. And as I said previously, I just want to highlight that, you know, trauma is experienced differently by everybody. So what impacts one doesn't necessarily impact another. So it's important to keep that at the forefront of your mind when you're thinking about how best to support your client. And then just managing the risk of re-traumatization. So again, when we're going to court, quite often we're going through evidence and information in quite an in-depth detail. So we're becoming more aware of how to manage the risks of someone experiencing the situation again, and those emotions that they felt at the time. Because we know as well that having to go back over a traumatic event can ingrain that further into the brain and cause the trauma to be further prolonged or cause further harm to that individual. And then just looking at how, as legal advisors, we can best support our clients going forward with this information and why it's important to us. So I touched on the fact that those that have experienced trauma in some way can find it difficult to trust people. So as legal advisors, it's really important that first and foremost we build trust with clients, and we acknowledge what they've kind of had to go through. The way we can build trust with clients, again, this all might seem quite obvious, but we're dealing with people that have been through quite significant events that can present differently. Each individual will present differently to you, but you can build trust with your client by listening to their concerns, allowing them to speak through things with you at their own pace. So not kind of assuming that you'll get all the information at the first meeting, making sure that you're giving them that space to talk. Make them feel comfortable and ask them how you can address their fears. Is there something that you can do as an advisor to make that area a safe space and build trust and allow them to make their own choices and have a bit of control over the situation? As I mentioned, that's something that they lacked in the previous relationships. So what you're trying to do is create a new relationship where they know they can trust you, they're going to have choice and control over that situation. That's what's important to your client. And then you want to be able to offer your client choice over and as much control over the situation as possible. So that might mean having meetings in an area where they feel more comfortable, or initially maybe over Zoom calls to help you build that trust with them. It might be the case, for example, one of you guys, the client normally comes to see you, but you're off on annual leave, or you've had to attend to emergency, and you can't make the meeting, you've asked someone else to cover. Ask your client if they have a preference of who takes that meeting. They might have preference over gender or have built trust with somebody else. Allow them to have that control and choice over what's going on with the process. So collaborate with your client in the sense of ensure that they know you're trying to help them achieve a desired outcome. You're helping them to understand the legal process and what support's available to them. Work in a way that suits your client. So we know that people process information differently. So once you've had a meeting, you might want to follow up with your client by email or a formal letter, just to allow them the space and time to process what's happened in that meeting at their own pace. Empowering your client to build better lives for themselves after experiencing domestic abuse is really important. It's not really the situation of having experienced trauma or domestic abuse isn't something that needs to define an individual, and we can help support clients to move on from that. empowering them is about being knowledgeable about what choices they'll have, what support you can signpost them to. Even if it's the case that you can't help a client in the way you hope, that perhaps maybe they'll go back to a relationship, or they maybe won't seek out further help. The fact that you've listened to the client and you've heard the client is fundamental. A lot of the time, that's what someone's needing, is just someone to hear that they've been in this situation and they know that they can then come back if they need further support. And then creating a safe space for your client. So again, what you have to remember is safety is priority for your clients. They might still be in a situation where their safety is at risk. So always keep that at the forefront of your mind when you're advising your clients. Think about, again, your physical space that you're using. And overall, over Zoom and stuff just now. But even that, thinking about what your environment's like, if it's away from distractions, make sure you're blocking out time in your diary that is adequate to give your client time to talk. Think about the tone and body language you're using as well, because quite often people that have experienced trauma will pick up on little things. Again, that's just safety for them. It's triggers because they don't know when a partner's going to lash out or when circumstances are going to change, so they're very attuned to what's going on around them. And just bear in mind that often your client's going to want to talk to you about things that are really upsetting and quite difficult. You're there to kind of support them and listen to them and make that process as easy for them as you possibly can. So it's really important you create a safe space for them. And then finally, what you can do as an individual is make sure you're knowledgeable in what's going on. So in terms of civil and criminal proceedings that might be happening, any changes in legislation, be aware that quite often your client might be going through both civil and criminal proceedings at the same time. So in terms of civil, they might be looking at family law, so custody, children, and splitting up assets and that kind of thing. That might be going in the background, as well as criminal things that are happening in court relating to an accused person. So you might be supporting them through a bit more. So make sure you're aware of the differences and the different processes of that. Know where you can kind of signpost your client. So places like Women's Aid or Citizens Advice Bureau that Zoe did her talk on last week are always quite good places. And then just also be aware of what local solicitors can provide, because they can give legal advice on more complex issues such as immigration, because that's an area that is always changing. You want somebody that's knowledgeable in that area. And then just looking at the impact of trauma on us as advisors. So just looking at vicarious trauma onto the next slide there. So vicarious trauma is a process of change resulting from empathetic engagement with trauma survivors. So this part is really for us as advisors to be aware of, that you're dealing with really emotional, upsetting, and quite difficult information a lot of the time. So it's just to be aware of the effect that can have on you as an individual, and to kind of be there for each other as colleagues and how we can manage that. So we can see there that the signs, these are not the only signs of vicarious trauma, but they're just a few signs that you might want to look out for, including feeling bystander guilt, shame, or self-doubt, becoming overly emotional with a client, or staying busy and isolating yourself. So it's just to really highlight the importance of self-care and how you can manage the effects of taking on vicarious trauma by having a healthy work-life balance and being realistic about what you can achieve. You're not there to fix clients, you're not there to solve all their problems, you're there as a toolkit, as a support for them, but not at a detriment to yourself. So you can't really pour from an empty cup, as they say. So it's just to make aware of that. That's an impact, that something that can impact us as workers. So just to summarise there, what I've kind of been over, is a lot of information. So I'll just go into the last slide there, which just gives you a summary of everything I've been over. So the kind of key things for us is just to keep up to date with changes that are going on, have a good understanding of what domestic and then finally understanding how that can impact us and as colleagues. So I've popped onto the last slide there, just some resources that we use as solicitors that can give you a bit more information about trauma. So that's actually, it's a bit of a whistle stop tour, but there is like a lot of kind of reading on this area. It's a big area, and as solicitors we're only kind of just starting to take note of it. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to try and answer those.
Well, thank you so very much, Zhaira, for such wonderful, wonderful presentation. I think it's been absolutely brilliant. Your presentation has been so wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. That was quite very insightful. I've learned a lot. I am sure others have also learned a lot from this presentation and on the impact of trauma on different aspects. And I'm sure they will have questions as well, or even contributions. So right now, I would like to keep the floor open for contributions. It's quite an interesting area. It's very, very touchy area. That trauma is something that in one way or the other, victims and survivors of abuse, not just domestic abuse generally, they feel this. We feel trauma in one way or the other, and we have to handle it. It's been overlooked sometimes, but thank God we are now being more focused on this. So please, does anyone have questions or comments or contributions to add to the presentation now?
Yes, I was just wanting to ask you, Zhaira, if the client has come in such a shock stage, because when you get into physical, mental shock, how would you deal with that? Because they've come in so shocked, you know, they can't, well, sometimes shock makes you can't speak, you know. How would you deal with it as a person?
So it just would depend on your client, but I would say that's probably about having that safe space and giving them time. So if a client has initially maybe contacted you by phone and said, you know, and you can sort of get a sense of how people are as well. So if you know you've spoken to them initially and you think, right, this client's maybe going to need an hour or more, block out the time. When they first come to see you, make them comfortable, like offer them a cup of tea, just give them time to process what's going on. You might have blocked out an hour of your time and only get like 5 minutes information out of them, but that's okay. It's just making them aware that that's fine. They're not wasting your time, and they have made progress in some way, even just by coming in the door to speak to you. That is progress.
Thank you, well answered. Thank you, that's very understandable.
Thank you for that question, Amina, and then thank you for such a very concise answer from Zhaira. Any further comments or questions or contributions?
Just for me, I thought that was really, really helpful, and there are certain things that I wouldn't have necessarily thought of, like creating a safe works for them. So not really a question, but I just thought that was really, really helpful and something I hadn't actually considered.
Thanks, Holly. I think it's like Lawson said, it's an area that I think a lot of people overlook, and as lawyers as well, we're really guilty of it because we're very much just like, oh, this is a law. But I find it a really interesting area, and it does make you look at people differently and think about how you can really support them.
Yeah, that's true. Very, very true. Thank you so much, Holly, for that comment. And it's true that we have to recognize as lawyers that we are humans and we have the capabilities of being affected by these things. So we need to take care of our health, we need to take care of our emotions and our well-being. So I'm particularly thrilled because we touched at different aspects of how this trauma can affect clients. And you mentioned that it affects the ability to communicate very well and to recall. And you highlighted that it affects the ability to trust others, difficulty in controlling emotions, and then it affects confidence. It's a very, very important aspect of our life that we can't just toil with like that. So thank you so much. I would like to pick up on something that you mentioned, why others are looking into more questions and comments. You did mention you mentioned re-traumatization. I think it's really very important to look at that as well. Re-traumatization, that is when someone re-experiences the same emotions that they have experienced before, or multiple traumatic events and all that. So what could be the causes of this re-traumatization? I don't know. Can you throw more light on
that? So re-traumatization can happen, like, so for instance, if someone is going to court and they have to go through evidence and what's happened, it tends to be like, if you're not adjusting your questions and your styles to that person, you're not picking up on the cues that maybe, you know, the person's struggling. So it's being attuned to that. It's quite difficult because everybody's different, everybody will respond to things differently. So it's once you build that trusting relationship, the safe space, you get to know your client, you'll be able to know how to manage that aspect of re-traumatization. Hope that answered the question.
Indeed, actually, thank you, because I'm just, it's quite curious and worrisome when you think you've dealt with one particular trauma and then you get re-traumatized. I think it's not a good thing, and it's worth looking into the things that can help to assuage that. Very, very, very important. So, any further questions? Any comments from the house? Right, while we are still contemplating.
Not a question, it's just to compliment you on how you explained about the 3 brains, to let us know. So it was a very good presentation, and I didn't really know how the brain worked in that way, and so scientifically it slotted like a jigsaw puzzle of my brain together. So thank you very much.
Great.
Very good
Thank
presentation.
you. Thanks very much.
I think that was really brilliant too. I agree with Camila on that. That was really brilliant. At a point in time, I felt that you were a medical doctor because the way you were describing the whole thing. Wow. That's really nice. So thank you so much.
I'm not smart enough to be a medical doctor, that's for sure.
So, yes. Any further comments, questions? I would like to pick up again, if you don't mind, on what you mentioned, vicarious trauma. It's quite a tricky one, where my understanding is that when the person who is trying to assist or support a traumatized victim or survivor gets traumatized. Is that right? When you receive the trauma as a result of trying to tend to others who have been in trauma. So, and it's quite an interesting aspect. This is my first time of actually hearing about the concept. And you mentioned that the signs are the feelings of bystander, guilt, shame, or self-doubt, becoming overly emotional or emotionally involved with a client, staying busy, and isolating yourself from others. So how can one strike the balance if you are meant to show empathy and compassion to someone who is being traumatized, and at the same time you're not meant to be overly involved emotionally? So how can you strike the right balance so that you're not vicariously receiving the trauma. I don't know whether that makes sense at all.
Yeah, I think it is tough because, like I say, you're dealing with some really emotive stories, and it can be difficult to kind of separate that. But I think you have to keep in the forefront of your mind that you're there to support the client, and you can't do that if you're emotionally involved. So there needs to be a fine line between like empathy and professionalism, and thinking that you can only help this person if you're using the logical part of your brains that they're not able to use. So that's what you're kind of doing for your client. And just making sure you're checking in with your colleagues, like discuss things with colleagues. They'll be able to give you different viewpoints on how to handle situations, and be able to kind of guide you if you're being too emotionally involved or invested in something.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. Very, very helpful. Thank you so much. Does anyone still have questions, contributions?
I think just on that comment, I don't know if it works for anyone else, but in similar situations, what's worked for me is kind of balancing between focusing on being empathetic towards someone while you're talking to them, but trying to maintain that focus on what are the outcomes I needed from this meeting, what information did I need to find out and go and secure. And that, I think that kind of helps you focus on the more logical side of things and not getting too emotionally involved. But that's just maybe my kind of what works for me personally. But I was kind of told that by someone before, is making a bit of a few top level notes about what you want to achieve from the meeting, and that really does help you kind of stay focused on track with it, and I guess not get too emotionally involved, because you know that you're in that meeting to get something out of it, while kind of maintaining that empathetic relationship with the client.
That's helpful. Thank you so much, Holly, for that contribution. That's really very important to remember, that one has to strike the right balance, maintaining the right professional relationship, and also seeking for help when you know when you are in need of the help from your seniors, especially those who have handled similar situations, similar cases. So I think it's important we learn from them. Just talking about support, you did mention you brought a diagram of support, how to support clients. I think it's quite important to acknowledge how this support can be done. We are very much interested in, as much as we are interested in identifying the problems, we really want to see how the support aspect of it can be re-emphasized. And I want to re-emphasize that point that you highlighted, the different support available for your clients. One of it, you mentioned that trust has to be built, and I've given the people the choice, and collaborating with them, empowering them. Yeah, you mentioned empowering them, safe space, and the rest. So I think we need to really dwell more on that. How can one create a safe space? Talk more about a safe space. What constitutes a safe space or safe environment for client and for the lawyer?
So again, it'll just be dependent on your client, but if you know your client doesn't like small spaces, or doesn't like sitting having meetings with doors closed, or perhaps they prefer to have meetings with a female as opposed to a male. These are all things to take into consideration to make that experience better for your client. Little things like offering them tea when they come in the door, or if you're running late, letting them know, because quite often that can be a trigger for people as well, that unpredictability. So try and have some structure, as Holly had mentioned as well, like that's great, like having bullet points and stuff, and letting your client know what's going to happen in a meeting before they come, so you can manage their expectations. It's just little things like that will help them feel that they're able to open up, and create that safe space for them.
Just to add to that, normally, like when we have meetings and stuff, for the first time, the client might not be very open, might be a bit unsure sure like the trust would be an issue and stuff. But what we can do is gradually, when we have few meetings with the client, we can, when they feel comfortable with us, obviously that kind of a bond between you and a client, you could always understand from the client or find out what was the initial thoughts when the client came in and what was going through their mind. So there are points to make a note for the future meetings, and you know, kind of like safe space you mentioned about what the client would like. So kind of making those notes, and then the next meeting with someone else, you would always have those kind of points which you can touch and ask the client, and understanding of them better, and providing them the best service you can offer them and support, and feel more comfortable as well, I feel.
That's right. Thank you very much, Karina, for that contribution. You're very, very right. Creating that comfort, being comfortable around your client, and your client actually being comfortable around you, it's important. That's right. Like you said, because we tend to forget most times, like earlier mentioned, we tend to forget that those who are rendering the help actually sometimes may need some help as well, in order to make sure they are well equipped, in order not to fall into the vicarious trauma category. So one more thing from my side, if I may, about the aspect of cues, reading body cues and signs. You know, you mentioned that's part of creating a safe environment. If your body language and the cues read by the client portrays or sends a signal that doesn't make him or her comfortable, that could affect the support level. How do you think it is important that lawyers and people in position of support get some level of training on body language and cues? Or I don't know whether I'm making sense, to know how to really express to give the right expressions, basically.
Yeah, there is training that I can share with you guys that we do as solicitors. There is quite a focus on body language and tone, because we use that to assess evidence in court and things as well, and how somebody comes across. So yeah, I'm happy to share that sort of training. It's probably best, I would say, it's probably best delivered by someone, but there's plenty of videos and things that you can watch on it.
That'd be great. That'd be great. I think it's important, not just for lawyers, for us and everyone who works in the charity, who comes in contact with vulnerable people, that we portray the right body language, and we use the right language. I mean, verbal language, I mean. So I think it's important that we look into that aspect as well. Like you said, and we would be happy if you've got any materials, if you're willing subsequently to do further presentation on that aspect. That would be very welcome. Any further questions, any comments and feedback from anyone, any area you really want to address on trauma, or you have experiences you want to share, stories you want to share that you know, things that we should be aware of, and things that we can focus our delivery on as well?
What has been the toughest thing for you? What has been the toughest thing for you, Zhaira?
For me, sorry,
Yes.
to deal with, sorry.
Yes, to deal with.
I would say there's probably not one situation, but like as I say, I find this area quite interesting. So I find a wee bit frustrating sometimes in my job role when people don't understand the impact that trauma can have on people, and how they might present. So I think like a lot of the legal profession, we're kind of stuck in our ways. It's older people that are quite well experienced, and sometimes you see this as maybe airy-fairy, but I do think it's so important and can make a real difference to people, because I think when you've had a positive experience with the law, or you've had the right support, it can make all the difference going forward. So
Yes.
I think it's maybe not so much an experience, but just frustration, I think. And it is getting better. Like, people are becoming more informed. So
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for the question, Kamina.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Any further questions? I think Zara has done a lot of work. It's a very brilliant presentation. For there to be less questions, that shows a sign that the work has been really, really understood by everyone. Thank you so very much. Any feedback? Any further questions?
Yeah, it just come to my mind
Yeah.
that when you talk with vulnerable clients or something, because when they talk about their past experience, they will become a bit like emotional. So like sometimes the way you communicate with this kind of vulnerable clients, you need to be careful. And also sometimes when they talk about their case matters, what happened before, they might be a bit like not very objective because they have their emotion in. And sometimes when you try to communicate with the client and want to figure out what's the real objective things, and this might be difficult because sometimes it's not complying with his emotion. So sometimes you should, with a bit of skill, like you can not ask directly about the fact or something, like you need to like speak about the case matters. I think that would help you to work more when you're dealing with this kind of vulnerable clients. I think to deal with their emotion first. Yeah, this is what I
Thank you so much.
think about.
Yeah.
And thanks for your very nice.
Just to add, well, and it could be quite hard for a client to again go through and express things, because to make you aware and understand what they've been through, to think about and be mindful of that as well at that point of the meeting, the initial meetings as well, I believe, I feel. But lovely presentation. I forgot to mention this earlier. Great presentation. Thank you for that.
Yes. Thank you so much for that contribution. Thank you so very much, Karuna, and thank you, Zara, for your lovely, wonderful presentation. Any further feedback? Okay, if we do not have further feedback, just to recap what basically the summary of what Zara did today. I think I'm very much interested as well in the support aspect. The summary, the key point is that keep up to date with current changes on trauma, and we should try to understand domestic abuse, what it is. We should also try to understand the impact of domestic abuse on people, the victims and survivors. We try to understand and establish respectful relationships. We should be able to establish respectful relationships. And Zara also mentioned that we should empower our client. We should try and empower our client so that they can be comfortable around us. She mentioned as well that safety is a priority when advising a client. That safety is a priority. And then that we should consider the office space, create a safe space for the client. And finally, that we should understand the impact on you and your colleagues when creating a safe working environment. Those are some of the key points for today. Thank you very much, Zara. Thank you everyone who has contributed to this surgery today. We're so grateful. We have Reverend Abiola Crown in the house. I don't know whether she has anything to add, any questions or comments or feedback to give to us.
Sincere apology for joining the meeting late. I sent a note to Lawson. I had an emergency to attend to. And I would like to say thank you very much for Zhaira for that great presentation. I missed a lot of it, but I'm so glad that it's been recorded, and I can always go back to play it back. Once more, I would like to say thank you to every one of us who had been helping us in this department. Your contributions are very priceless, and we do not take it for granted.
Wonderful, wonderful impact to us. So it's good to celebrate her. Thank you so very much. And thank you, Zhaira, once again. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Karuna. Thank you, Tin. Thank you, Kamina. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Karen Wood. And thank you, everyone who has joined us and who will be joining us later. Next week, we will announce very soon what we're going to discuss and the person who is going to take us on the topic as well. So look forward to next week, and I look forward to seeing us again next week Saturday. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful weekend as you enjoy the sun, if you have sun around there.
Thanks, everyone. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Have a
you.
good weekend, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Let's get out. Leave.
Okay, I think we are just